It started like any other peaceful morning on my ranch. The sun rising over the rolling hills, birds chirping, and the scent of fresh earth carried by the light breeze. My property, a sprawling slice of rural heaven, nestled just outside the city limits, was my sanctuary. Years of hard work had gone into cultivating the land, building a modest but comfortable home, and creating a life free from the noise and chaos of urban living. But all of that changed the moment I opened the letter from the HOA. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. I'd always been a rule follower, respectful of community guidelines, and kept my property well maintained. Yet here was a formal notice telling me that the HOA was initiating proceedings to force me out of my own ranch. The letter was terse and cold, citing multiple violations, vague enough to sound serious, but specific enough to unsettle me. The violations included alleged breaches I hadn't even heard of before, unauthorized agricultural structures, excessive noise from livestock, and an obscure clause about aesthetic non-compliance. The kicker was the ultimatum. I had 30 days to comply or face eviction proceedings. My stomach sank. I reread the letter, trying to find any error, any loophole, anything that could explain this sudden assault on my home. I knew the HOA had a reputation for being strict, but eviction, that seemed extreme, almost vindictive. I called the HOA office immediately, demanding a meeting to discuss the charges. The receptionist was polite but unhelpful, directing me to attend the next board meeting where everything would be explained. It was clear the HOA wasn't interested in hearing my side before taking action. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of anxiety. I tried to reason with the board, sending emails, attending meetings, and documenting everything meticulously. But Brenda, the HOA president, was relentless. She seemed to have personal reasons for targeting me, dismissing my explanations and waving off my attempts at compromise. Neighbors who once greeted me warmly now avoided eye contact, wary of becoming collateral damage in the brewing conflict. The ranch that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a battleground. One evening, after a particularly heated board meeting where I was shouted down, I sat on my porch, staring out at the open fields. The idea that I might lose this land, my home, my investment, my legacy, was unbearable. That's when it struck me. If they wanted to push me out, maybe I could push back, harder. What if I didn't just defend my property, but took control of theirs? What if the tables were turned? It sounded crazy, but desperation fuels bold ideas. And so began my research, digging through public records, zoning maps, and HOA documents. What I found shocked me. The HOA owned a parcel of land adjacent to my ranch, land that had been under their control for decades, yet was underutilized, forgotten, and potentially up for sale. If I could buy that land, I could change the balance of power. I could protect my ranch and maybe even negotiate from a position of strength. But before I could do that, I had to survive the eviction attempts. The fight was just beginning. The quiet life I'd built was about to become the most intense challenge of my life. The moment I received the eviction notice from the HOA, I knew I couldn't just sit back and hope it would all blow over. This was my home, the land I'd poured years of sweat, money, and soul into, and I wasn't going to let a bureaucratic nightmare take it from me without a fight. The first step was to understand the battlefield. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to start digging into the legal framework that governed HOAs in my state. I spent countless nights poring over HOA statutes, property laws, and my community's specific covenants. My goal was simple: find the cracks in their armor. I started with the HOA's Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC and Rs. This dense document was the Bible for my neighborhood. It laid out the rules everyone was supposed to follow, including the HOA's powers and limits. I read it cover to cover, underlining sections that seemed relevant to my case. One glaring fact emerged quickly. While the HOA had broad authority to enforce community standards, their power to evict a homeowner was extremely limited and conditional. The eviction process required clear, documented violations and a formal hearing, both of which, I realized, the HOA had glossed over. This discovery gave me hope. They couldn't just decide to kick me out on a whim. Next, I looked into the state laws regulating homeowners associations. I found statutes that mandated due process, meaning the HOA had to give homeowners a fair chance to respond to accusations and appeal decisions. The law also required the board to act reasonably and in good faith, not arbitrarily. That was where the problem lay. The HOA board's behavior, especially Brenda's, seemed vindictive rather than reasonable. Several of their complaints were vague or contradicted earlier approvals. For example, the unauthorized structures they cited included a small open-air shed I had built years ago, which the board had previously inspected and signed off on. I documented every interaction with the HOA, emails, meeting minutes, and even voicemails. I began to build a timeline that showed their inconsistencies and failure to follow proper procedures. I also reached out to a local real estate attorney specializing in HOA disputes. After a lengthy consultation, she confirmed my suspicions. The HOA's eviction attempt was not only premature, but potentially illegal. She recommended I prepare to defend my rights aggressively, including filing a formal complaint if necessary. The lawyer also introduced me to an unexpected concept: quiet title action. This legal process could clear up any property ownership disputes, which could be crucial if the HOA tried to claim parts of my ranch or limit my use of the land. I started considering whether this might be a tool to regain control. While all this legal strategizing was going on, I connected with others in the neighborhood, quietly dealing with their own battles with the HOA. It was surprising how many residents felt intimidated but never spoke out. We began sharing information and resources, creating a small support network. This collective strength was comforting and emboldened me. Armed with knowledge and legal advice, I was ready to push back, not with emotion or shouting, but with facts, evidence, and a clear plan. But the biggest revelation was still ahead. One evening, while digging through county property records online, I stumbled across something extraordinary. The HOA owned a large tract of land bordering my ranch, land I'd never known about, seemingly forgotten and unused for years. This land had never been part of the neighborhood development plan. It was essentially dormant property under HOA control. That discovery changed everything. If I could purchase that land, I could literally change the game. It would give me leverage against the HOA, protect my access routes, and potentially force them to negotiate on terms favorable to me. It was an audacious idea, but at this point, I was ready to take audacious steps. The next chapter in this fight would be about turning knowledge into action, making moves that would surprise everyone, including the HOA. Finding out that the HOA owned a significant parcel of land adjacent to my ranch felt like uncovering a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. I could hardly believe that after all these years, this piece of property had been quietly sitting unused while tensions boiled between me and the HOA. It started as a casual search in the county property records, a resource I'd been studying meticulously ever since the eviction notice arrived. These records listed every parcel, its owner, boundaries, zoning designations, and transaction history. Most of the listings were familiar: neighbors' homes, small commercial spots, and community spaces. But there, just next to my property, was a large swath marked as HOA owned. Its dimensions were surprising, several acres of open land stretching along one of the main access roads I used daily. The implications hit me like a bolt. If the HOA owned this land and if it was as neglected as it appeared, then this wasn't just a patch of dirt. This was a potential power play waiting to happen. The land wasn't included in the usual HOA amenities like parks or community centers. There were no walking trails or recreational facilities, just a fenced-off, somewhat overgrown tract that seemed forgotten by the board and the residents alike. Curiosity turned into determination. I had to know more about this property, its status, its value, and whether it was for sale or even accessible for purchase. I requested the full property file from the county recorder's office. The paperwork revealed that the HOA had acquired the land years ago through a donation from a developer who had abandoned plans for expansion. Since then, the HOA had used it minimally, mostly for occasional maintenance or storage, but never developed it or offered it to residents. The HOA board minutes I could get access to confirmed that the land was never on anyone's priority list. In fact, several board members had mentioned selling it off to reduce HOA debt, but nothing had materialized due to internal disagreements and lack of buyer interest. That was the crack I needed to widen. If I could buy that land myself, I would shift the balance of power. Not only would I gain more space and control over the access points to my ranch, but I could also disrupt the HOA's plans, or lack thereof. But this wasn't just about the land, it was about ownership, authority, and leverage in the ongoing dispute. Buying that land could force the HOA to reconsider its heavy-handed approach toward me. The next step was to see if the HOA was actually willing to sell. I arranged a meeting with one of the HOA's less hostile board members, Greg. I'd met Greg at a few meetings. He was reasonable, low-key, and clearly uncomfortable with the escalating conflict. When I brought up the land, Greg's face tightened. "That property's a headache for us," he admitted. "We've talked about selling it for years, but can't seem to get the board to agree." "I'm interested in buying it," I said. "What's the process?" Greg hesitated but promised to bring it up at the next board meeting. I knew this was more than just a casual inquiry. This was the opening I needed. The following week, Brenda was noticeably agitated. Rumors started flying that I was plotting something big, that I was trying to corner the HOA and undermine community unity. But I kept my cards close to my chest. I did my homework on property valuation, talked to local realtors, and even started drafting possible offers. This was becoming more than a fight for survival. It was a strategic campaign to reclaim my peace and protect my home. Meanwhile, the community buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors reached out cautiously, curious about my intentions. Others were outright hostile, defending the HOA's right to hold the land. But I knew that knowledge was power, and right now I had both. Little did Brenda and the board know I was preparing to make a move that would change everything. This forgotten parcel was my ace in the hole, the key to not just surviving the HOA's attempts to push me out, but flipping the script entirely. The stage was set for a showdown that would go far beyond petty disputes and vague rules. By the time the HOA board finally scheduled a meeting to discuss the sale of their forgotten land, I was ready. Weeks of preparation, research, and silent maneuvering had brought me to this moment. The parcel next to my ranch, the land that had sat unused and ignored for years, was now the focal point of a brewing power struggle. I remember sitting at the edge of my kitchen table the night before the meeting, surrounded by stacks of documents, maps, and valuation reports. My mind was racing with possibilities and what-ifs. What if someone else showed up with a higher bid? What if the HOA board decided not to sell after all? What if this backfired, making Brenda even more determined to oust me? Despite the risks, I knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. If I lost this, I could lose everything. The next day, I arrived at the community center early. The room was packed, one more than usual for an HOA meeting. There was tension in the air, palpable and heavy. I could see Brenda at the front, eyes narrowed, clearly unsettled. Other board members whispered among themselves, some casting curious glances my way. When the agenda reached the land sale, Greg, the reasonable board member, presented the facts. The property was appraised at a price that surprised many. It was undervalued due to its unused status, but still represented a significant chunk of money for the HOA. Then came the big announcement. The board had decided to sell the land through a public auction, open to all residents and interested buyers. My heart pounded. This was it. I had arranged with the auction company beforehand, ensuring I was registered and ready. When my turn came, I stood confidently among the bidders. There were a few other interested parties, local developers, a couple of neighbors, and even a small investment group. The bidding started low, and I watched carefully, gauging each competitor. The prices ticked up steadily, and my hand shot up time and time again. My mind was laser-focused. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a statement. $250,000, I called out firmly. A developer countered quickly, $260,000. I raised it, $275,000. Back and forth we went, tension rising with every increment. At one point, Brenda stood near the door, her face flushed, whispering frantically to some board members. I caught her eye for a moment, a mixture of disbelief and fury in her glare. But I didn't falter. When the bidding reached $310,000, the developer dropped out. It was down to me and a local neighbor who hesitated. With one final bid, $320,000, I won the auction. The room fell silent for a moment before murmurs spread like wildfire. I had done it. I had bought the land. The legal process to transfer ownership was swift. Within weeks, the deed was in my name, and I officially owned the property. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a rush of relief and triumph. The land wasn't just a buffer zone or a piece of dirt anymore. It was my shield. But the victory was bittersweet. I knew Brenda and the HOA wouldn't take this lying down. There would be backlash, more meetings, probably legal threats. But I was ready for that. Owning the land gave me a new kind of power, one they couldn't easily ignore. That night, standing on the newly acquired property, looking across the fence at my ranch, I felt a deep sense of justice. The ranch that I had fought so hard to protect now had reinforcements. It was more than a physical boundary. It was a symbol that I wasn't going anywhere. This was just the beginning. The next battles would be fought in courtrooms and boardrooms, but for now I had the upper hand. Owning their land turned the tables. The HOA had tried to push me out, but instead I had pulled them into my world. And from here on out, the rules of the game were changing, on my terms. Auction day was a whirlwind of adrenaline, nerves, and strategy. A day I would remember for the rest of my life. The room was packed with more people than I expected, all buzzing with curiosity and tension. It was clear this auction had ignited a fire in the community, and everyone wanted to see how it would unfold. As I stepped into the venue, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on me. This wasn't just a property sale. It was a test of wills between me and the HOA, a battle for control that had been simmering for months. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional with a booming voice, called the room to order. He explained the rules. Bids would start at a base price set by the HOA's appraiser, and anyone could bid publicly. I scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces, some supportive neighbors, a few skeptics, and of course, HOA board members. Brenda sat stiffly near the front, her eyes flickering with suspicion and irritation every time I raised my hand to bid. The bidding began cautiously. A few initial bids came from local realtors and investors, but it quickly became clear the room was waiting for me to make the first big move. I raised my hand steadily, signaling my intent to fight for the land. At $200,000, the tension ramped up. A developer from a nearby town stepped in, determined to take the property for commercial purposes. His bids were aggressive, pushing the price higher than I anticipated. With every counterbid, my heart pounded harder. I reminded myself that this was more than money. This was about standing my ground. When the price hit $280,000, the developer paused briefly, and I seized the moment to push it further. My bid of $300,000 caught a few gasps from the audience. I wasn't just playing. I was making a statement. Brenda's face turned pale as she whispered something to her fellow board members. It was clear they hadn't expected me to go this far. The bidding narrowed to just me and the developer. The room grew quiet, all eyes on us. At $320,000, I made my final bid. The developer hesitated, glanced around, and then dropped out. I had won. Cheers erupted from a handful of supporters in the room, but Brenda's expression was stormy, a mix of disbelief and frustration. The auctioneer slammed the gavel down, officially declaring me the winner. The room was abuzz with whispers, speculation, and shifting power dynamics. In the days following, word spread quickly. I'd managed to turn the tables on the HOA in a way nobody expected. The once passive property now belonged to me, and the implications were enormous. Owning the land gave me leverage not only to protect my ranch, but to challenge the HOA's authority in ways I hadn't imagined before. But with victory came new challenges. Brenda and the board were already scrambling, consulting lawyers and plotting their next moves. They sent letters demanding reconsideration, alleging procedural errors in the auction, none of which had merit but were clearly attempts to intimidate me. Despite the pushback, I remained calm and resolute. I knew my rights and had the legal backing to stand firm. That weekend, I walked the perimeter of my newly acquired land, envisioning the future. This wasn't just a buffer zone anymore, it was a fortress. I started planning improvements, fencing, signage, and even security measures to ensure no one could challenge my ownership lightly. Neighbors began approaching me, some curious, others cautiously optimistic. A few admitted they were relieved someone was finally standing up to the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. The dynamics of our little community were shifting. I wasn't just a homeowner fighting eviction anymore. I was a force to be reckoned with. This auction day drama had changed everything. It proved that even against powerful, entrenched organizations like the HOA, an individual with determination, knowledge, and courage could fight back and win. As I settled into this new chapter, I knew the real battle was just beginning. But for now, I could savor this hard-fought victory. A victory that wasn't just about land, but about standing up for what's rightfully mine. The dust settled briefly after the auction, but the real storm was just beginning. My unexpected victory sent shockwaves through the HOA boardroom. Brenda's tight grip on power was slipping, and the entire board was scrambling to figure out their next move. Almost immediately after I took ownership of the land, the HOA's tone shifted dramatically. Where before they had tried to intimidate me with vague threats and eviction notices, now their actions became more aggressive and direct. I began receiving a flurry of letters and emails from the HOA's legal counsel, many of them filled with baseless accusations, claims of procedural errors in the auction, and warnings about potential litigation. But their legal threats didn't shake me. I'd prepared thoroughly, and my attorney assured me that the auction was conducted properly and that my ownership was legally sound. They had no real ground to stand on. Brenda, however, wasn't just relying on lawyers. She started calling neighborhood meetings, rallying residents to her cause. She portrayed me as a troublemaker, someone trying to destabilize the community by hoarding property and creating divisions. It was classic spin to turn public opinion against me. Yet, as I attended those meetings, mostly to keep an eye on their tactics, I noticed cracks in the HOA's united front. More neighbors were quietly supportive, or at least curious about my side of the story. They were tired of Brenda's authoritarian style and the constant drama. Meanwhile, the HOA board attempted to pass new rules and regulations aimed directly at me. They proposed restrictions on land use, new fencing ordinances, and increased fines for any violations related to my property. It was a thinly veiled effort to pressure me into selling the land back or giving up. I refused to budge. Instead, I responded by further securing my property. I installed clear boundary markers, updated the fencing, and even set up a small security camera system to monitor any trespassing or suspicious activity. I wanted to make it clear. This was my land, and I was serious about protecting it. The most surprising development came when the HOA tried to block my access to the land's main entrance. They argued that the road leading to the property was a common area under their control and attempted to restrict my use of it. This was their biggest mistake. I consulted my attorney again, who confirmed that I had legal rights of access as the owner of the property. I was prepared to take this issue to court if necessary. To send a clear message, I hired a surveyor to officially map the access points and documented everything meticulously. When the HOA tried to erect barriers on the road, I took photos, recorded videos, and informed the local authorities about the situation. The local sheriff's department responded with a visit, advising the HOA that blocking my legal access was not permissible and could lead to serious consequences. Brenda's reaction was explosive. She accused me of harassment and creating unnecessary conflict, but the sheriff's intervention made it clear who was in the right. During this time, I also continued building alliances with neighbors. I shared my story, explained my rights, and encouraged them to question the HOA's increasingly hostile behavior. Some joined my cause openly. Others remained silent but supportive. The HOA's power seemed to be eroding, replaced by uncertainty and infighting. Brenda's once commanding presence was now marked by frustration and desperation. Despite the chaos, I stayed focused on the bigger picture, protecting my ranch, my property, and my peace of mind. I realized that winning the land was just one step. Maintaining control and defending it against ongoing attacks would be a marathon, not a sprint. The aftermath of the auction was a lesson in resilience, patience, and strategy. It taught me that when you fight back with facts, legal backing, and community support, even a powerful entity like an HOA can be challenged. But I also understood that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I had to remain vigilant, prepared, and unyielding. And as the HOA scrambled to regain control, I was ready to stand firm, knowing the land was now mine. Legally, morally, and strategically, the battle lines were drawn clearly after the auction and the HOA's failed attempts to regain control of the land. I realized that mere defense wasn't enough anymore. If I wanted to secure my ranch and finally put an end to the relentless harassment, I needed to go on the offensive. This meant carefully planning a series of strategic moves designed to force the HOA to reconsider their approach and, ultimately, to respect my rights as a property owner. First, I focused on leveraging the land itself. The parcel wasn't just a symbol of victory, it was a powerful asset. I began exploring its potential uses, not just for myself, but for the community. While the HOA had neglected the land for years, I saw opportunities to turn it into a positive resource. I proposed to some neighbors that we transform part of the property into a shared community garden or a small wildlife habitat area. This suggestion was twofold. It demonstrated my goodwill and community spirit, while also making it clear that I wasn't interested in hoarding or exclusion, but responsible ownership. Interestingly, this move caught many by surprise. Some neighbors who had been skeptical began warming up to the idea, appreciating that I wasn't just opposing the HOA for the sake of conflict, but genuinely interested in improving the neighborhood. Meanwhile, I started attending every HOA meeting I could, not just as a resident, but as a property owner with legitimate concerns and proposals. I used these forums to voice my plans, ask questions, and challenge any attempts to undermine my rights. One of the most crucial strategies was transparency. I made all my communications with the HOA public, posting letters and meeting minutes on a dedicated website I created for neighbors. This openness contrasted sharply with Brenda's secretive, closed-door tactics and helped build community trust around my position. The HOA's response was predictable. They tried to discredit me, claiming I was stirring unrest and acting outside the bounds of HOA rules. But I had anticipated this and had legal counsel ready to back me up. Whenever they pushed too hard, I calmly pointed out their own rule violations and lack of transparency. A turning point came when I proposed a joint committee involving myself, other residents, and HOA board members to manage community resources more fairly, including the land I'd purchased. This committee would oversee maintenance, usage, and future development, with clear rules agreed upon by all parties. At first, Brenda and the board rejected the idea outright. They didn't want to share control or acknowledge my stake in the community. But with growing neighbor support and pressure from their own members demanding a less hostile environment, the board reluctantly agreed to discuss the proposal. I knew this was a small victory, but a critical one. It forced the HOA to acknowledge my presence and my rights in an official capacity. At the same time, I began quietly working with local officials and zoning boards to understand how the land could be used within existing regulations. This knowledge gave me further leverage. If the HOA continued their obstruction, I could pursue legal avenues to develop or use the property in ways they might not like, but couldn't stop. Throughout all of this, I maintained a calm, professional demeanor. I avoided personal attacks or inflammatory language, focusing instead on facts, rights, and community benefit. This approach contrasted starkly with the HOA's escalating hostility and internal infighting. The more they tried to provoke me, the more I stayed steady and strategic. I also used the media to my advantage. When local reporters caught wind of the story, a resident standing up to a powerful HOA, I shared my side openly, emphasizing fairness, legal ownership, and the need for community cooperation. The public attention put additional pressure on the HOA board, especially Brenda, who found herself increasingly isolated and scrutinized. By combining legal savvy, community engagement, and strategic communication, I gradually shifted the balance of power. What started as a desperate fight to keep my home had transformed into a carefully orchestrated power play, one that forced the HOA to stop bullying and start negotiating. I wasn't just defending my land anymore, I was shaping the future of the community on my own terms. And Brenda, for all her bluster, was running out of options. One of the most unexpected yet welcome shifts in this ongoing battle was how the community began to change. Not because I forced it, but because the truth became undeniable. The HOA's iron grip, once nearly absolute, was starting to loosen, and neighbors who had stayed silent or aligned with Brenda were gradually waking up to the reality of the situation. For months, Brenda's tactics had relied on intimidation, control, and fear. She convinced many that her decisions were final, that opposing her meant trouble or social isolation. But as I persisted, neighbors saw firsthand how her leadership was more about personal vendettas than community welfare. The turning point came during a casual neighborhood barbecue I organized, inviting residents, including a few board members who had been quietly disillusioned with Brenda's leadership. I made sure the event was open, friendly, and focused on sharing ideas rather than confrontation. Conversations flowed freely, and many expressed frustration about how the HOA had been managed. People were tired of closed meetings, secret decisions, and the constant drama surrounding the land dispute. They appreciated hearing my side of the story, the facts, the legalities, and most importantly, my vision for a more inclusive community. Several neighbors approached me after the event, offering their support. Some shared that they had wanted to speak up before but feared backlash from Brenda and her loyalists. Others admitted they felt trapped by the HOA's heavy-handed rules and wanted change. With these new allies, I began building a grassroots movement within the community, a coalition focused on transparency, fairness, and collaboration. Together, we drafted a letter requesting the HOA board reconsider their policies, improve communication, and involve residents in decision-making processes. The letter was signed by dozens of homeowners, a clear message that the old way of doing things was no longer acceptable. Brenda and the board initially dismissed the letter, calling it an attempt to undermine authority. But the mounting pressure was impossible to ignore. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a classic David versus Goliath conflict, a small group standing up against an entrenched, powerful board. This coverage embarrassed the HOA leadership, especially Brenda, who had prided herself on maintaining control. Around this time, some board members began quietly distancing themselves from Brenda, signaling that cracks were forming within the leadership. Rumors circulated about resignations and votes of no confidence, further weakening the HOA's influence. Capitalizing on this shift, I proposed a series of community workshops and open forums where residents could voice concerns, suggest improvements, and participate in decision-making. These forums were a game changer. They fostered dialogue and cooperation, and more importantly, demonstrated that community governance could be inclusive and transparent, a stark contrast to Brenda's secretive style. The HOA board reluctantly agreed to support these initiatives, though their enthusiasm was tepid at best. Still, it was a start. During one particularly revealing meeting, a former board member publicly criticized Brenda's leadership, calling for reforms and accountability. This bold move galvanized even more residents to speak up. Meanwhile, my ownership of the contested land became a symbol of resistance and empowerment. Neighbors began to see it not as a threat, but as a protected space that could benefit everyone if managed properly. I continued to maintain the property meticulously, clearing debris, planting trees, and installing signage that welcomed visitors while respecting privacy. The sense of community pride began to grow. By the end of this chapter in the saga, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was undeniably weakening. Brenda's influence waned as her opposition gained momentum and respect. What had started as a personal fight to protect my ranch had blossomed into a broader movement for community justice and reform. And while challenges remained, the path forward was clear. Together, we could build a neighborhood where every voice mattered, including mine. With the HOA's grip weakening and community sentiment shifting, the board, led fiercely by Brenda, knew they had to act fast. What had once been a position of unquestioned authority was now precarious, teetering on the edge of collapse. Desperate and determined, Brenda rallied her remaining loyalists for one final attempt to reassert control over the land and, more broadly, the community. This last stand came in the form of an emergency board meeting, hastily scheduled and heavily guarded by a few enforcers Brenda trusted. The agenda was clear: stop me before I could consolidate my influence and permanently undermine the HOA's power. Word of the meeting spread quickly through the neighborhood. Many residents, still skeptical but eager to witness how this would unfold, showed up, some openly supporting me, others simply curious. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation and unease. Brenda opened the meeting with a blistering speech accusing me of undermining community values, breaking rules, and harboring selfish interests. Her rhetoric was sharp and aggressive, designed to rally support and intimidate dissenters, but it fell on many deaf ears. I stood up calmly and presented my case, a clear, detailed recap of the events that led to my ownership, the legal backing I held, and the positive steps I had taken to improve the land and foster community collaboration. I emphasized my commitment to fairness and transparency, directly contrasting it with the board's previous conduct. The crowd reacted positively, with several neighbors nodding and some even applauding. Brenda's face tightened, visibly frustrated by the lack of support. What followed was a series of desperate motions by the board, attempting to invalidate the auction results, block my property rights, and impose restrictive covenants on my land. Each proposal was met with resistance from other board members, neighbors, and even the community lawyer, who pointed out glaring legal flaws. Brenda's power was slipping through her fingers, and the more she grasped, the more her arguments became erratic and unconvincing. In an attempt to regain the upper hand, she suggested an immediate vote to seize control of my land under the pretext of protecting community interests. But this motion was met with strong opposition and ultimately failed. The atmosphere grew chaotic. Voices rose, some shouting over others. The once unified board fractured further, with factions openly disagreeing and some members openly siding with me. As the meeting drew to a close, Brenda's anger boiled over. She accused me of destroying the neighborhood and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. In the aftermath, several board members resigned or distanced themselves from her leadership, signaling the end of her era. The community, energized by the dramatic showdown, rallied behind reform efforts and more inclusive governance. Though the battle was far from over, this final desperate attempt by the board had backfired spectacularly. Instead of regaining control, they accelerated their own downfall. For me, it was a validation that standing firm and playing by the rules, while engaging with neighbors openly, was the path to lasting victory. The HOA's last stand had crumbled, and the future belonged to those willing to build rather than bully. The dust settled after the board's dramatic last stand, and what emerged was more than just a victory for me. It was a chance for our entire community to heal, rebuild, and redefine itself. The conflict that had torn through the neighborhood like a wildfire had left scars, but also opportunities for growth and renewal. With Brenda's departure and the fracturing of her loyal faction, the HOA was left at a crossroads. The board was no longer a monolith of power, but a body in transition, facing demands for transparency, fairness, and meaningful engagement from residents who wanted a real voice. I felt a deep responsibility, not just as the landowner who had fought to defend my property rights, but as a neighbor committed to helping rebuild trust and cooperation. The hard lessons of conflict had taught me the value of dialogue, patience, and empathy. One of my first initiatives was to reach out directly to neighbors who had been on the fence or even opposed me during the earlier phases of the battle. I wanted to open channels of communication and find common ground. I organized community meetings with open forums, no agendas, but an opportunity for people to express concerns, share ideas, and contribute to shaping the neighborhood's future. These gatherings fostered a remarkable shift in atmosphere. Instead of the tension and suspicion that had dominated before, there was cautious optimism and a sense of shared purpose. Residents began collaborating on projects that had been stalled for years, repairing common areas, improving lighting, and developing community spaces on shared land. I also worked with new board members committed to reform. Together, we revised HOA bylaws to ensure more transparency, clearer communication, and protections for property owners' rights, including mechanisms to prevent another power grab like Brenda's. Importantly, I encouraged the inclusion of diverse voices on the board, making sure that leadership reflected the community's broad interests rather than a narrow faction. Meanwhile, my ranch land, once the center of conflict, became a symbol of renewal. I dedicated parts of it to community-friendly uses, like a walking trail and a small picnic area, accessible to all residents. This gesture wasn't just goodwill, it was a declaration that property rights and community harmony can coexist. The new board supported these efforts, promoting policies that encouraged neighborly cooperation and discouraged divisiveness. Over time, the neighborhood began to thrive. People smiled more, greeted each other, and worked together on initiatives large and small. The legacy of the conflict was not forgotten, but it became a catalyst for positive change rather than ongoing bitterness. Personally, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just in protecting my land, but in helping to transform a fractured community into a healthier, more resilient one. Reflecting on the journey, I realized how important it had been to stay calm, informed, and strategic through the chaos. Fighting for your rights is never easy, especially when facing powerful opposition. But with perseverance, legal knowledge, and community support, it's possible to prevail. Now, as the neighborhood moves forward together, I'm hopeful about the future. The story of how an HOA tried to kick me out, only to see me buy their land and auction it off, could have ended in bitterness and division. Instead, it became a story of victory and renewal, a testament to standing your ground and building bridges rather than walls. And as I watch my neighbors enjoy the land and the peace we've created, I know that this hard-fought battle was worth every moment.